Question 1. Governance review demonstrates that a wealth management firm is experiencing significant pressure to increase its client acquisition rate to meet ambitious growth targets. A prospective client, a large institutional investor with substantial assets under management, has expressed strong interest in engaging the firm's services. The sales team is eager to onboard this client quickly, suggesting a streamlined onboarding process that involves accepting the client's provided documentation with minimal independent verification, citing the client's high profile and perceived low risk. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm in this situation? Option A. Inform the prospective client that the firm's standard onboarding procedures are too lengthy for their needs and suggest they seek services elsewhere. Option B. Expedite the onboarding process by accepting the prospective client's self-declared information and documentation, as their substantial assets suggest a low risk and high value to the firm. Option C. Delegate the full responsibility of due diligence for this high-value client to the sales team, trusting their judgment to expedite the process while ensuring basic documentation is collected. Option D. Proceed with the onboarding process only after completing all standard Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks, including independent verification of the client's source of funds and beneficial ownership, even if it delays the onboarding timeline. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the onboarding process only after completing all standard Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks, including independent verification of the client's source of funds and beneficial ownership, even if it delays the onboarding timeline. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. The pressure to onboard new clients quickly, especially those with potentially high revenue, can lead to overlooking crucial due diligence steps. This requires careful judgment to balance commercial objectives with regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes thorough Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) procedures before onboarding any new client, regardless of their perceived value. This aligns directly with the principles of investor protection and market integrity, which are foundational to financial regulation. Specifically, it upholds the regulatory duty to identify and assess risks associated with clients, prevent financial crime, and ensure that the firm is not facilitating illicit activities. This proactive stance is a cornerstone of responsible financial conduct. Correct approaches analysis. An approach that bypasses or significantly shortens the standard KYC/AML checks for a high-value prospective client demonstrates a failure to adhere to regulatory mandates. This creates a significant risk of onboarding a client involved in money laundering or other financial crimes, which is a direct violation of AML regulations and can lead to severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of license. It also undermines the principle of treating all clients with appropriate scrutiny, regardless of their potential financial contribution. Another incorrect approach involves relying solely on the prospective client's self-declaration of their source of funds, without independent verification. This is insufficient under most regulatory frameworks, which require robust due diligence and verification of information provided by clients. It exposes the firm to the risk of accepting funds from illicit sources, thereby becoming complicit in financial crime. Finally, an approach that delegates the full responsibility of client onboarding and risk assessment to the sales team without adequate oversight or adherence to established compliance protocols is also professionally unacceptable. Compliance is a shared responsibility, but ultimate accountability for regulatory adherence rests with the firm. This delegation without proper controls can lead to inconsistent application of policies and a higher likelihood of regulatory breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a risk-based approach to client onboarding, ensuring that all due diligence measures are proportionate to the identified risks. This involves a clear understanding of regulatory expectations regarding customer identification, verification, and ongoing monitoring. When faced with commercial pressures, professionals must escalate concerns to compliance departments and senior management, rather than compromising on regulatory standards. A robust internal control framework, regular training, and a culture that prioritizes compliance over short-term gains are essential for navigating such challenges effectively. Question 2. Process analysis reveals that a financial advisor, while reviewing a client's recent trading activity, notices a pattern of highly unusual and potentially manipulative trades executed shortly before a significant company announcement. The advisor suspects the client may be engaging in insider dealing or market manipulation, but lacks definitive proof. The advisor's primary duty is to their client, but they also have a regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Ignore the suspicious activity to avoid jeopardizing the client relationship and potential future business. Option B. Conduct a thorough internal investigation, gathering all available information and consulting with the firm's compliance department before making any external reports. Option C. Advise the client to cease all trading activity immediately and refrain from further communication until the situation is resolved. Option D. Immediately report the suspicious trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority, citing the advisor's suspicions. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the suspicious trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority, citing the advisor's suspicions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential market abuse. The Magnit hiring assessment test likely assesses understanding of regulatory frameworks governing financial markets, specifically focusing on insider dealing and market manipulation. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the duty of loyalty to a client with the broader responsibility to maintain market integrity, as mandated by regulations. Careful judgment is required to discern when a client's actions cross the line from aggressive but legal trading to potentially illegal market abuse, without prematurely or incorrectly accusing the client. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective investigation before taking any action that could have severe consequences for the client and the firm. This involves gathering all relevant information, consulting internal compliance and legal departments, and adhering strictly to the established reporting procedures. This aligns with regulatory requirements that mandate firms to have robust systems and controls in place to prevent and detect market abuse. Specifically, it upholds the principle of innocent until proven guilty, while simultaneously fulfilling the firm's supervisory and reporting obligations under relevant financial conduct regulations. An incorrect approach that involves immediately reporting the client's actions without sufficient investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This would constitute a breach of client confidentiality and potentially lead to unwarranted reputational damage and legal repercussions for the client. It fails to adhere to the principle of due process and the requirement for evidence-based reporting. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the suspicious activity due to a desire to avoid conflict or maintain client relationships, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes the firm's responsibility to actively monitor for and report market abuse, exposing the firm and its employees to significant penalties and undermining market integrity. Such an action could be interpreted as complicity or negligence. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with such situations. This process should begin with identifying the potential regulatory breach. Next, it involves gathering all pertinent facts and evidence objectively. Following this, consultation with internal compliance and legal experts is crucial to interpret the facts within the specific regulatory framework. The decision on how to proceed should then be based on this expert advice and the firm's established policies and procedures, ensuring that any action taken is proportionate, justified, and compliant with all applicable laws and ethical standards. Question 3. The evaluation methodology shows that a financial advisor is considering recommending a complex derivative product to a client. The client has expressed a desire for capital preservation and has a low tolerance for risk. The advisor has not fully investigated the client's understanding of financial instruments beyond basic savings accounts. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethics? Option A. Proceed with the recommendation, emphasizing the potential for higher returns, and assume the client will ask questions if they do not understand. Option B. Decline to recommend the derivative product and instead suggest a low-risk investment option that aligns with the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, while also recommending further education for the client on more complex instruments. Option C. Recommend the derivative product, but provide a lengthy technical disclosure document that the client can review at their leisure. Option D. Recommend the derivative product, highlighting its potential benefits, and inform the client that the firm's compliance department has pre-approved the product for all client types. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the recommendation, emphasizing the potential for higher returns, and assume the client will ask questions if they do not understand. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the complexities of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct within the financial services industry, specifically concerning client suitability and disclosure. The Magnit hiring assessment test likely aims to gauge an understanding of these principles as applied in a real-world context. Careful judgment is required to ensure that client interests are prioritized and that all actions align with the regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to upholding the regulatory obligations of client suitability and transparency. This involves a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before recommending any product or service. Furthermore, it necessitates clear and comprehensive disclosure of all relevant information, including potential risks and conflicts of interest, as mandated by regulatory bodies. Adhering to these principles ensures that recommendations are in the client's best interest, thereby fostering trust and mitigating regulatory and reputational risks. An incorrect approach that fails to adequately assess client suitability would represent a failure to comply with regulations such as those governing investment advice and client protection. This could lead to significant regulatory penalties, including fines and sanctions, and damage to the firm's reputation. Ethically, it constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty or a similar obligation to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, such as omitting or downplaying material risks associated with an investment, would violate disclosure requirements. This not only exposes the client to undue risk, but also breaches regulatory mandates for full and fair disclosure. Such actions can result in severe consequences for both the individual and the firm, including legal liabilities and disciplinary actions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Understand the client. Thoroughly assess the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of financial markets. 2. Identify suitable products/services. Based on the client's profile, identify investments or services that align with their needs and risk appetite. 3. Disclose all relevant information. Provide clear, concise, and comprehensive information about the product or service, including its features, benefits, risks, costs, and any potential conflicts of interest. 4. Document the process. Maintain detailed records of all client interactions, assessments, recommendations, and disclosures. 5. Seek clarification and advice. If unsure about any aspect of the client's situation or the suitability of a product, seek guidance from supervisors or compliance departments. 6. Prioritize client interests. Always place the client's best interests above personal gain or firm targets. Question 4. The assessment process reveals that a candidate has provided incomplete information regarding their previous employment history, which is crucial for evaluating their suitability for a role. The assessor, believing this information is vital and that the candidate might be withholding it intentionally, considers accessing publicly available professional networking profiles to gather the missing details without directly asking the candidate again. Option A. Ask a colleague who may have interacted with the candidate in a previous professional capacity if they have any insights into the candidate's employment history. Option B. Directly request the candidate to provide the missing employment history details, explaining the necessity for the assessment and assuring them of data confidentiality. Option C. Proceed with the assessment using only the information provided by the candidate, acknowledging the potential gaps in their employment history. Option D. Access the candidate's publicly available professional networking profiles to gather the missing employment history details, assuming this information is fair game for assessment purposes. The correct answer is B. Directly request the candidate to provide the missing employment history details, explaining the necessity for the assessment and assuring them of data confidentiality. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the need for efficient information gathering during an assessment and the strict regulatory requirements for data privacy and consent. The assessor must navigate the delicate balance of obtaining necessary information without infringing upon an individual's rights or violating data protection laws. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are compliant and ethically sound. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining explicit consent before collecting sensitive personal information. This aligns directly with the principles of data protection, such as those found in the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, if the jurisdiction were the EU or similar data privacy laws in other jurisdictions. Obtaining consent ensures transparency, respects individual autonomy, and mitigates the risk of legal repercussions for unauthorized data processing. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and builds trust with the individual being assessed. An incorrect approach that involves collecting information without explicit consent, even if it seems relevant to the assessment, constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be a violation of data protection laws, leading to fines and reputational damage. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the assessor and disrespects the individual's right to privacy. Another incorrect approach, such as making assumptions about what information is acceptable to collect based on the assessment's purpose without verifying consent, also fails to uphold regulatory standards. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the legal framework governing data handling. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework governing data collection and privacy. Before any information is gathered, assessors should identify what data is truly necessary for the assessment's stated purpose. They must then proactively seek and obtain explicit, informed consent from the individual, clearly explaining what data will be collected, why it is needed, how it will be used, and how it will be protected. If there is any ambiguity regarding consent or data handling, the assessor should err on the side of caution and seek clarification or alternative, compliant methods of obtaining the required information. Question 5. System analysis indicates that a financial services firm is developing a new predictive analytics model using customer transaction data. To comply with data privacy regulations, the firm intends to anonymize this data before feeding it into the model. The proposed anonymization method involves replacing customer names with unique, randomly generated alphanumeric codes. Which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory compliance and protects customer privacy? Option A. Relying solely on the internal IT department's assurance that the alphanumeric codes are sufficiently random and cannot be linked back to individuals without further information. Option B. Proceeding with the analysis using the pseudonymized data, assuming that the removal of direct identifiers is adequate for regulatory purposes. Option C. Implementing a robust anonymization technique that includes techniques beyond simple pseudonymization, such as data aggregation, generalization, or suppression, and conducting a thorough re-identification risk assessment to validate its effectiveness against potential external data linkages. Option D. Replacing customer names with randomly generated alphanumeric codes, as this process is considered sufficient anonymization under most data privacy frameworks. The correct answer is C. Implementing a robust anonymization technique that includes techniques beyond simple pseudonymization, such as data aggregation, generalization, or suppression, and conducting a thorough re-identification risk assessment to validate its effectiveness against potential external data linkages. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in regulatory compliance where a firm must balance the need for efficient data processing with the stringent requirements of data privacy and security. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying the relevant regulations to a novel technological implementation, ensuring that the chosen method of data anonymization does not inadvertently compromise the effectiveness of the analysis or, more critically, the privacy of the individuals whose data is being processed. The risk of re-identification, even with anonymized data, is a significant concern, requiring careful consideration of the anonymization technique's robustness. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the anonymization technique's effectiveness against the specific regulatory standards for data privacy. This includes evaluating its resistance to re-identification attacks. Considering the context of the data and potential external datasets, that could be used for linkage. Best professional practice dictates a proactive and risk-based approach, ensuring that the chosen method aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, as mandated by regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. If the jurisdiction were the EU, or equivalent principles in other specified jurisdictions. Focus is on demonstrating due diligence and implementing safeguards that are proportionate to the risks involved, thereby maintaining compliance and protecting individual rights. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to assume that any form of data alteration, such as simple pseudonymization without further safeguards, is sufficient for compliance. This fails to meet the higher standard of anonymization required by many data protection laws, which aims to make re-identification impossible. Such an approach risks regulatory penalties and reputational damage due to a breach of privacy. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the analytical utility of the data above all else, implementing anonymization methods that are easily reversible or ineffective. This demonstrates a disregard for the fundamental rights of data subjects and a failure to adhere to the core tenets of data protection regulations, which place a strong emphasis on safeguarding personal information. A third incorrect approach involves relying solely on internal assessments without seeking independent validation or expert consultation on the anonymization technique's effectiveness. This can lead to a false sense of security and may not adequately identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for re-identification, thus failing to meet the standard of care expected under regulatory frameworks. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a systematic approach to regulatory compliance, starting with a clear understanding of the applicable laws and guidelines. When dealing with sensitive data processing, a risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential privacy threats. The selection of data processing and anonymization techniques should be guided by these identified risks and the specific requirements of the regulation. It is crucial to document the entire process, including the rationale for choosing particular methods and the measures taken to ensure compliance. Regular review and updates to these processes are also essential, especially as technology and regulatory interpretations evolve. Seeking expert advice and independent validation can further strengthen the compliance framework. Question 6. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a firm is evaluating potential future market disruptions. Which of the following approaches best aligns with proactive risk management and regulatory expectations for anticipating and mitigating future threats? Option A. Developing scenario-based analyses that incorporate emerging trends, geopolitical factors, and technological advancements to model potential future impacts. Option B. Delegating the entire risk assessment process to the compliance department without senior management review. Option C. Analyzing historical data of past market crashes to identify patterns and probabilities of recurrence. Option D. Focusing on immediate operational efficiencies to maximize short-term profitability, assuming future market conditions will remain stable. The correct answer is C. Analyzing historical data of past market crashes to identify patterns and probabilities of recurrence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to move beyond a superficial understanding of risk assessment and apply it to a dynamic, evolving situation. The challenge lies in discerning the most appropriate methodology when faced with incomplete or ambiguous information, and understanding the implications of choosing one approach over another in terms of regulatory compliance and effective risk management. The need for a forward-looking perspective, rather than a purely historical one, is critical. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of proactive risk management, which is a cornerstone of regulatory frameworks like those governing financial services in the UK e.g. FCA Handbook. Specifically, it emphasizes forward-looking analysis, considering potential future events and their impact, rather than solely relying on past occurrences. This aligns with regulatory expectations for firms to identify, assess, and mitigate risks before they materialize. By focusing on emerging trends and potential future scenarios, this approach ensures that risk mitigation strategies are relevant and effective in a changing environment, thereby fulfilling the duty of care and promoting financial stability. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that solely relies on historical data without considering current market shifts or emerging threats fails to meet regulatory expectations for a dynamic risk assessment. This can lead to a false sense of security and leave the firm vulnerable to unforeseen events, potentially breaching principles of adequate risk management and due diligence. An approach that prioritizes immediate, short-term gains over a comprehensive assessment of potential long-term risks is ethically unsound and often in conflict with regulatory mandates that require a balanced consideration of all material risks. This can result in a failure to identify and manage systemic or reputational risks that may not have immediate financial implications, but can have severe consequences later. An approach that delegates the entire risk assessment process to junior staff without adequate oversight or validation is a failure of governance and management responsibility. Regulatory bodies expect senior management to be accountable for the firm's risk management framework. This abdication of responsibility can lead to significant oversight gaps and a failure to identify critical risks, potentially resulting in breaches of regulatory requirements related to internal controls and risk culture. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the specific regulatory context and its expectations for risk identification and mitigation. They should then consider the nature of the business and the types of risks it faces. The decision-making process should involve evaluating different assessment methodologies based on their ability to provide a forward-looking and comprehensive view of potential threats and opportunities. This requires critical thinking to discern which approach best addresses the specific uncertainties and complexities of the situation, ensuring that the chosen method is robust, adaptable, and compliant with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 7. Strategic planning requires a robust framework for anticipating and managing potential threats. When developing a comprehensive risk assessment process, which of the following methodologies best ensures that emerging and significant risks are identified and prioritized effectively, while remaining compliant with regulatory expectations for proactive risk management? Option A. Implementing a structured risk assessment framework that categorizes risks by their potential impact and likelihood, using a documented methodology for scoring and prioritization, and regularly reviewing the assessment against evolving business objectives and the external environment. Option B. Prioritizing risks based on the frequency of internal departmental complaints and the perceived urgency of those complaints by senior management. Option C. Relying exclusively on a review of historical risk events and internal audit findings from the past 3 years to identify and assess current threats. Option D. Focusing solely on risks that have a direct and immediate financial impact, disregarding potential reputational or operational risks that may manifest over a longer horizon. The correct answer is A. Implementing a structured risk assessment framework that categorizes risks by their potential impact and likelihood, using a documented methodology for scoring and prioritization, and regularly reviewing the assessment against evolving business objectives and the external environment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for proactive risk identification with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the dynamic nature of the business environment. A firm must not only identify potential risks, but also prioritize them effectively to ensure that the most significant threats are addressed with appropriate mitigation strategies. Failure to do so could lead to unforeseen losses, reputational damage, and non-compliance with regulatory expectations. The correct approach, which involves a systematic and documented process for identifying, assessing, and prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, represents best professional practice. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate robust risk management systems. For instance, in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) Handbook e.g. CISC 3.1.1r requires firms to have adequate systems and controls in place, which implicitly includes a well-defined risk assessment process. This systematic approach ensures that risks are not overlooked and that resources are deployed efficiently to manage the most critical threats. It also provides a clear audit trail for regulators. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data, without considering emerging trends or future uncertainties, would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the forward-looking nature of risk management and could leave the firm vulnerable to new or evolving threats. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting the firm and its stakeholders. Another incorrect approach, which is to focus only on risks that have materialized in the past, ignores the principle of proactive risk management. While past events offer valuable lessons, they do not encompass the full spectrum of potential future risks. This approach is reactive rather than strategic and can lead to a false sense of security. It may also contravene regulatory expectations for firms to anticipate and prepare for potential future disruptions. Finally, an approach that prioritizes risks based on the loudest internal complaints rather than objective assessment criteria is also professionally unsound. This method is subjective, prone to bias, and does not reflect a structured or data-driven risk assessment. It can lead to misallocation of resources, neglecting significant but less vocalized risks, and potentially failing to meet regulatory requirements for a comprehensive risk management framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves 1. Establishing clear risk appetite and tolerance levels. 2. Developing a comprehensive risk universe. 3. Defining assessment criteria, impact and likelihood. 4. Implementing a consistent methodology for scoring and prioritizing risks. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating the risk assessment. And 6. Integrating risk management into strategic decision-making processes. Question 8. Strategic planning requires a clear understanding of the regulatory landscape and internal control frameworks. When faced with an urgent need to pivot the company's hiring strategy in response to unforeseen market demands, which of the following actions best exemplifies a professional and compliant approach within the Magnit hiring assessment test's regulatory environment? Option A. Proceed with the new hiring strategy based on the consensus of the most senior executive present, assuming that their authority supersedes the need for formal documentation and broader consultation. Option B. Convene an emergency meeting with key stakeholders to discuss the proposed strategic shift, conduct a rapid risk assessment, and obtain interim approval for a pilot implementation while formalizing the full strategy and seeking final sign-off. Option C. Delay any strategic changes until a full, comprehensive review of the revised strategy can be completed, even if this means missing the immediate market opportunity. Option D. Immediately implement the revised hiring strategy to capitalize on the market opportunity, documenting the changes retrospectively and seeking approval after the fact. The correct answer is D. Immediately implement the revised hiring strategy to capitalize on the market opportunity, documenting the changes retrospectively and seeking approval after the fact. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing the need for timely strategic adjustments with the imperative of maintaining robust internal controls and compliance with regulatory frameworks. The pressure to respond quickly to market shifts can tempt individuals to bypass established procedures, potentially leading to significant compliance breaches and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that agility does not come at the expense of adherence to the Magnit hiring assessment test regulatory environment. The correct approach, which involves a structured review and approval process even for rapid strategic shifts, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the principles of good governance and risk management, ensuring that any strategic change is vetted for its potential impact on compliance, operational integrity, and financial reporting. Specifically, it upholds the spirit of the Magnit hiring assessment test's emphasis on thorough evaluation and adherence to established protocols, preventing ad hoc decisions that could violate internal policies or external regulations. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over process risks several regulatory and ethical failures. For instance, implementing a strategic change without proper documentation or risk assessment could violate internal control requirements mandated by the Magnit hiring assessment test's framework, which likely emphasizes accountability and auditability. Furthermore, bypassing established approval channels could be seen as a breach of fiduciary duty, as it undermines the oversight mechanisms designed to protect the organization and its stakeholders. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on informal consultations without formalizing decisions, fails to create a clear audit trail and can lead to misinterpretations or selective implementation, thereby compromising transparency and fairness, which are core ethical tenets. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a systematic approach to strategic planning. This involves clearly defining objectives, identifying potential risks and mitigation strategies, consulting relevant stakeholders, and adhering to established governance and compliance procedures. When faced with urgent situations, the framework should include provisions for expedited review and approval processes that still maintain essential control points, rather than eliminating them. This ensures that strategic agility is achieved within a compliant and ethically sound structure. Question 9. Operational review demonstrates that a wealth management firm is experiencing significant growth in new client acquisition. To maintain this momentum, the onboarding team is proposing to streamline the client acceptance process by relying heavily on client self-declarations for source of funds and wealth, with minimal independent verification. The firm's compliance officer is concerned about the potential regulatory implications of this proposed shortcut. Which of the following actions best addresses the compliance officer's concerns and upholds regulatory standards? Option A. Delegate the entire due diligence process to an external third-party provider without establishing clear oversight or quality control mechanisms. Option B. Proceed with onboarding clients based on their stated intentions and projected future earnings, assuming they will eventually meet the firm's financial criteria. Option C. Accept client self-declarations for source of funds and wealth without further verification, provided the client is introduced by a reputable existing client. Option D. Implement a tiered due diligence process where the level of verification is proportionate to the assessed risk of the client, ensuring enhanced due diligence for higher-risk individuals and entities, and maintaining robust documentation throughout. The correct answer is D. Implement a tiered due diligence process where the level of verification is proportionate to the assessed risk of the client, ensuring enhanced due diligence for higher-risk individuals and entities, and maintaining robust documentation throughout. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the regulatory obligation to conduct thorough due diligence. The pressure to onboard new clients quickly, especially in a competitive market, can lead to shortcuts that compromise compliance. The firm must balance commercial objectives with its fiduciary duties and legal responsibilities, requiring careful judgment to avoid regulatory breaches and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process for assessing the suitability of a new client. This includes verifying the client's identity, understanding the source of their funds, assessing their risk profile, e.g., in relation to money laundering or terrorist financing, and ensuring that the proposed services align with the client's stated objectives and the firm's regulatory permissions. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations, which are fundamental to maintaining market integrity and preventing financial crime. Adhering to these procedures demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, safeguarding both the firm and the financial system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with onboarding based solely on a client's stated intentions without independent verification or risk assessment. This fails to meet the fundamental requirements of due diligence and exposes the firm to significant regulatory risk, including potential fines and sanctions for non-compliance with AML/KYC obligations. It also creates an ethical failure by potentially facilitating illicit activities. Another incorrect approach is to delegate the entire due diligence process to the client, accepting their self-certification without any independent checks. This is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations, which place the responsibility for due diligence squarely on the financial institution. Such an approach demonstrates a severe lack of professional diligence and a disregard for regulatory frameworks designed to protect the financial system. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of onboarding over the thoroughness of the due diligence process, accepting incomplete or superficial information. This indicates a commercial bias that overrides regulatory and ethical responsibilities. It increases the likelihood of onboarding high-risk clients or engaging in activities that are not in the client's best interest or are contrary to regulatory requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to client onboarding. This involves first identifying the potential risks associated with a new client and the proposed business relationship. Based on this risk assessment, the level of due diligence should be determined. For high-risk clients, enhanced due diligence measures are required. Documentation is crucial at every stage, providing an audit trail to demonstrate compliance. If at any point the due diligence process reveals red flags or insufficient information to satisfy regulatory requirements, the firm should be prepared to decline the client or the business relationship. This decision-making process prioritizes regulatory adherence, ethical conduct, and the long-term integrity of the firm and the financial markets. Question 10. The assessment process reveals that a client who has a moderate risk tolerance and limited investment experience expresses strong interest in a highly speculative, illiquid investment product that promises potentially high returns, but carries a significant risk of capital loss. The advisor has a duty to act in the client's best interest and comply with all relevant regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor in this situation? Option A. Present the speculative investment to the client, highlighting the potential for high returns while verbally warning them about the significant risks involved. Option B. Immediately dismiss the client's interest in the speculative investment, stating that it is too risky for them without further discussion. Option C. Proceed with recommending the speculative investment, assuming the client's expressed interest overrides the advisor's assessment of risk. Option D. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to determine if the speculative investment aligns with the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. If it does not, explain why and propose suitable alternative investments. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to determine if the speculative investment aligns with the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. If it does not, explain why and propose suitable alternative investments. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in financial advisory: balancing client needs with regulatory obligations when a client expresses interest in an investment that carries significant risks not fully understood by the client. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to exercise sound judgment, prioritize client well-being, and adhere strictly to regulatory frameworks designed to protect investors. The advisor must navigate the client's desire for potentially high returns against the inherent dangers of the investment, ensuring that any recommendation is suitable and compliant. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before even considering specific products. This aligns with the core principles of investor protection embedded in regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial advice. By conducting a comprehensive suitability assessment, the advisor ensures that any recommended investment is appropriate for the client, thereby fulfilling their fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations. This proactive approach minimizes the risk of mis-selling and potential client harm, upholding the integrity of the advisory profession. An incorrect approach that involves immediately presenting the high-risk investment, even with a verbal warning, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This bypasses the crucial suitability assessment, potentially exposing the client to losses they cannot afford or are unprepared for. It prioritizes the advisor's potential commission or the client's immediate interest over the client's long-term financial health and regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the client's interest outright without exploring alternatives or understanding their motivations, fails to serve the client's needs adequately and could damage the professional relationship. It also misses an opportunity to educate the client about appropriate risk levels and suitable investment strategies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's complete financial profile and objectives. This should be followed by an assessment of their risk tolerance and capacity for loss. Only then should potential investment products be considered, with a clear emphasis on suitability. If a client expresses interest in a high-risk product, the advisor must thoroughly explain the risks, potential downsides, and suitability in relation to the client's profile. If the product remains unsuitable, the advisor must clearly articulate why and suggest suitable alternatives that align with the client's profile and regulatory guidelines. Transparency, client education, and adherence to regulatory requirements for suitability are paramount. Question 11. Assessment of how a financial advisor should respond when a client, who has recently experienced a significant personal loss and expresses a desire to invest a large inheritance in highly speculative, short-term trading strategies, is presented with the following options for their response. Option A. Agree to implement a portion of the requested strategy while simultaneously suggesting a more conservative allocation for the remainder of the inheritance, without fully explaining the risks of the speculative component. Option B. Engage in a detailed fact-finding process to understand the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term goals, and then explain why the requested strategy may not be suitable, offering alternative, more appropriate investment options. Option C. Immediately implement the client's requested speculative trading strategy, assuring them that their desire for quick returns will be accommodated. Option D. Politely decline to implement the strategy, stating that it is too risky without further discussion or exploration of alternative options. The correct answer is C. Immediately implement the client's requested speculative trading strategy, assuring them that their desire for quick returns will be accommodated. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific investment strategy and the advisor's fiduciary duty to recommend what is truly in the client's best interest, even if it deviates from the client's initial request. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional state and potential lack of full understanding of the risks involved, while adhering to regulatory requirements and ethical principles. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the advisor's responsibility to protect the client from potentially unsuitable recommendations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance before making any recommendations. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice, ensuring that any proposed strategy is suitable and appropriate. Specifically, it upholds the regulatory framework's emphasis on suitability and the ethical obligation to act in the client's best interest. By engaging in a detailed fact-finding process and explaining the rationale behind any divergence from the client's initial request, the advisor demonstrates transparency and professionalism, building trust and ensuring informed consent. An incorrect approach that involves immediately implementing the client's requested strategy without further due diligence fails to meet the suitability requirements. This could lead to a recommendation that is not aligned with the client's actual financial capacity or risk appetite, potentially exposing them to undue losses. This constitutes a regulatory failure by not adhering to the Know Your Client principles and an ethical failure by not acting in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the client's request outright without a proper explanation or alternative, demonstrates poor client relationship management and a lack of empathy. While the advisor may be acting on a belief that the client's request is unsuitable, the manner of communication can erode trust and alienate the client. Ethically, this approach fails to engage in constructive dialogue and educate the client, which is part of the advisor's role. A third incorrect approach, which involves subtly guiding the client towards the requested strategy by downplaying risks or exaggerating potential benefits, is a clear breach of ethical conduct and regulatory guidelines. This constitutes misrepresentation and a failure to provide accurate and balanced information, directly violating the duty of care and the principle of acting with integrity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, actively listen to and understand the client's stated objectives and rationale. Second, conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment knowledge. Third, evaluate the suitability of the client's requested strategy against this assessment and relevant regulatory standards. Fourth, if the requested strategy is deemed unsuitable, clearly and respectfully explain the reasons, referencing specific risks and potential negative outcomes. Fifth, propose alternative strategies that are suitable and aligned with the client's objectives, explaining the benefits and risks of each. Finally, document the entire process, including the client's request, the advisor's assessment, the recommendations made, and the client's final decision. Question 12. Comparative studies suggest that professionals often face situations where they possess non-public information that, while not directly material to a current client's specific transaction, could indirectly influence their judgment or create an appearance of impropriety due to a personal financial interest. If a professional learns that a company they are advising a client on is about to be acquired by a larger entity in which the professional holds a significant personal investment, what is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Proceed with advising the client as usual, assuming the personal investment is not directly related to the client's specific portfolio and therefore not a material conflict. Option B. Inform the client about the personal investment but continue advising without seeking explicit consent, believing that transparency is sufficient. Option C. Immediately inform the client of the potential conflict of interest arising from the personal investment and seek their explicit consent to continue advising on the matter, explaining the nature of the conflict and its potential implications. Option D. Disclose the personal investment to the client and then withdraw from advising them on this specific matter to avoid any perception of conflict. Correct answer is C. Immediately inform the client of the potential conflict of interest arising from the personal investment and seek their explicit consent to continue advising on the matter, explaining the nature of the conflict and its potential implications. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's duty to its clients and the potential for personal gain, which can compromise objectivity and trust. The core of the dilemma lies in managing insider information and the appearance of impropriety, even if no explicit rule is broken. Careful judgment is required to uphold the firm's reputation and client confidence. The correct approach, which involves immediately disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the client and seeking their explicit consent before proceeding, represents best professional practice. This aligns with fundamental ethical principles of transparency, client advocacy, and avoiding conflicts of interest. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations that mandate clients be fully informed about any circumstances that might impair a professional's judgment or loyalty. This proactive disclosure ensures the client can make an informed decision about whether to continue with the professional's services, thereby safeguarding their interests and maintaining the integrity of the professional relationship. An incorrect approach of proceeding without disclosure, assuming the information is not directly material to the client's specific situation, fails to recognize the broader ethical obligation. This can lead to regulatory breaches related to disclosure requirements and a breach of fiduciary duty, as the professional's judgment may be unconsciously influenced by their personal interest. The appearance of impropriety, even without actual wrongdoing, can erode client trust and damage the firm's reputation. Another incorrect approach of informing the client but not seeking explicit consent before proceeding is also professionally unacceptable. Disclosure is a step in the right direction. It is insufficient without the client's affirmative agreement. This still leaves room for the professional's judgment to be compromised and does not fully empower the client to make a decision about their representation. It can be seen as a failure to adequately manage the conflict of interest and a potential violation of client autonomy. Finally, an incorrect approach of dismissing the information as irrelevant and continuing without any client communication is a direct violation of ethical duties. It demonstrates a disregard for potential conflicts and a lack of diligence in protecting client interests. This can lead to severe regulatory sanctions for failing to disclose material information and acting in a manner that could be perceived as self-serving. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the potential conflict of interest. 2. Assess the materiality and impact of the conflict on the client's interests and the professional's objectivity. 3. Consult relevant firm policies and professional conduct guidelines. 4. Determine the appropriate course of action, which typically involves full disclosure to the client. 5. Obtain explicit, informed consent from the client before proceeding. 6. Document all communications and decisions. 7. If a conflict cannot be adequately managed, consider withdrawing from the engagement. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows that a financial advisor has been assigned to manage the investment portfolio of a long-term client. During the initial meeting, the advisor realizes that the client is the sibling of their spouse. This personal connection was not previously known to the advisor. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Inform the client of the relationship but continue managing the portfolio, assuring them that personal feelings will not influence professional decisions. Option B. Discreetly manage the portfolio, hoping that the personal relationship does not create any complications or ethical concerns. Option C. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the client and the firm's compliance department and request to be recused from managing this client's portfolio. Option D. Proceed with managing the client's portfolio, ensuring to maintain strict professional objectivity and avoiding any preferential treatment. The correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the client and the firm's compliance department, and request to be recused from managing this client's portfolio. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the potential conflict between personal relationships and professional objectivity. Maintaining client confidentiality and avoiding conflicts of interest are paramount ethical and regulatory obligations. The difficulty lies in navigating a situation where a personal connection could inadvertently influence professional judgment or lead to a breach of trust. The correct approach prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance by immediately disclosing the personal relationship to the relevant parties and recusing oneself from any decision-making processes that could be perceived as biased. This upholds the principle of impartiality, safeguards client interests, and demonstrates adherence to professional standards that demand transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. It aligns with the core tenets of professional integrity, ensuring that all actions are taken with the utmost fairness and without undue influence. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without disclosure risks a serious breach of confidentiality and a conflict of interest. This could lead to regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and a loss of client trust. Failing to disclose a personal relationship that could influence professional duties is a direct violation of ethical codes and potentially specific regulations governing professional conduct, which often mandate disclosure and recusal in such circumstances. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to manage the situation discreetly without formal disclosure, is equally problematic. While seemingly an attempt to avoid disruption, it still carries the inherent risk of unconscious bias and a failure to meet the standard of transparency expected in professional dealings. This can still lead to a perception of impropriety and a violation of the duty to act in the best interests of all stakeholders. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear assessment of potential conflicts, immediate and transparent communication with all affected parties, and a commitment to recusal or other appropriate measures to ensure objectivity and maintain trust. Professionals must proactively identify situations where personal relationships might intersect with professional responsibilities and act decisively to mitigate any risks. Question 14. To address the challenge of potential conflicts of interest and the misuse of sensitive information, a financial analyst at a firm is privy to upcoming, material, non-public information regarding a significant client's acquisition. This information, if acted upon, could lead to substantial personal financial gain. The analyst must decide how to proceed while upholding their professional and regulatory obligations. Option A. Wait for the acquisition news to be publicly announced, then immediately make a highly leveraged trade based on the anticipated market reaction, even though the analyst knows the direction of that reaction due to their prior access to information. Option B. Refrain from any personal trading or discussion of the information until it is publicly disclosed, and then only trade if the information is widely disseminated and accessible to all market participants. Option C. Share the information with a close friend who is also a financial professional, suggesting they consider investing in the target company before the news breaks. Option D. Execute a personal trade to purchase shares of the target company immediately, leveraging the knowledge of the impending acquisition to secure a profitable position. The correct answer is B. Refrain from any personal trading or discussion of the information until it is publicly disclosed, and then only trade if the information is widely disseminated and accessible to all market participants. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's obligation to its clients and the potential for personal gain. The core ethical dilemma lies in balancing fiduciary duties with the temptation to exploit non-public information for individual benefit. Careful judgment is required to navigate the fine line between permissible market research and illegal insider trading, ensuring client interests are always paramount. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it strictly adheres to the Magnit hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, which emphasizes the prohibition of using material, non-public information for personal trading. This approach prioritizes client confidentiality and market integrity, aligning with the principles of fair dealing and preventing any appearance of impropriety. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and upholds the trust placed in professionals by their clients and the broader market. An incorrect approach that involves trading based on the anticipated positive news before it is publicly disclosed constitutes a clear violation of insider trading regulations. This action exploits privileged information, thereby undermining market fairness and potentially causing financial harm to other market participants. It breaches the duty of loyalty owed to clients and the firm, and exposes the individual and the firm to severe legal and reputational consequences. Another incorrect approach, which involves discussing the potential news with colleagues who are not directly involved in the client's project, also presents significant ethical and regulatory risks. While not directly trading, this action risks the leakage of material non-public information, increasing the likelihood of it being used improperly by others. This demonstrates a lack of diligence in safeguarding confidential information and can lead to a broader breach of confidentiality, even if unintentional. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying the personal trade until after the news is public, but then using the knowledge of the news impact to make a highly leveraged trade, still carries ethical concerns. While technically not insider trading, it leverages the knowledge gained through privileged access to make a speculative trade that could be seen as exploiting an informational advantage beyond what a typical investor would possess. This can still raise questions about fair dealing and the perception of using inside knowledge, even if the direct act of trading on non-public information is avoided. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's code of conduct and relevant regulations. When faced with information that could be considered material and non-public, professionals should err on the side of caution. This involves seeking guidance from compliance departments, refraining from any personal trading or discussion of the information with unauthorized individuals, and prioritizing the protection of client confidentiality and market integrity above all else. A robust internal control system and a culture that encourages ethical reporting are crucial for preventing such dilemmas. Question 15. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a financial advisor is presented with a complex structured product that offers potentially high returns, but also carries significant downside risk, including the potential loss of principal. The client, a moderately experienced investor, has indicated a medium risk tolerance. The advisor has conducted an initial risk assessment questionnaire, which suggests the client is comfortable with moderate risk. However, the advisor suspects the client may not fully grasp the intricacies and potential for capital loss inherent in this specific product. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Conduct a more in-depth discussion with the client to explain the product's specific risks, potential for principal loss, and how it truly aligns with their financial goals and capacity for loss, even if it means the product may not be suitable. Option B. Recommend a different, simpler investment product that clearly fits the client's stated risk tolerance without further investigation into the complex product. Option C. Focus on the potential high returns of the product during the client discussion, downplaying the risks to encourage the client to invest. Option D. Proceed with recommending the product, as the client's stated risk tolerance and questionnaire results align with the product's moderate risk profile, and the advisor has fulfilled their initial assessment duties. The correct answer is D. Proceed with recommending the product, as the client's stated risk tolerance and questionnaire results align with the product's moderate risk profile, and the advisor has fulfilled their initial assessment duties. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a financial advisor is tasked with assessing the suitability of an investment product for a client. The challenge lies in balancing the client's stated risk tolerance with the inherent risks of the product, especially when the product's complexity might obscure its true risk profile. Professional judgment is crucial to ensure that the advisor acts in the client's best interest, adhering to regulatory obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment that goes beyond the client's initial statements. This includes understanding the product's underlying mechanics, potential downsides, and how it aligns with the client's broader financial goals and capacity for loss. This aligns with the Magnit hiring assessment test's emphasis on regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, specifically the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and suitability, which mandate that financial products recommended must be appropriate for the client's circumstances, knowledge, and experience. This approach ensures transparency and protects the client from unsuitable investments, thereby upholding the advisor's fiduciary duty. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the client's self-declared risk tolerance without independent verification or deeper product understanding. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement of conducting a comprehensive suitability assessment. It also presents an ethical failure by potentially exposing the client to undue risk, which could lead to significant financial harm and reputational damage for the advisor and their firm. Another incorrect approach might involve prioritizing the sale of the product over the client's best interests, perhaps due to sales targets or incentives. This is a clear breach of ethical conduct and regulatory mandates that place client welfare above profit. A third incorrect approach could be to present a simplified, potentially misleading overview of the product's risks to make it appear more palatable, which constitutes a failure in transparency and honesty. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client well-being and regulatory adherence. This involves a multi-step process. First, thoroughly understanding the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk appetite through detailed questioning and documentation. Second, conducting an in-depth analysis of any proposed investment product, including its risks, rewards, costs, and complexity. Third, objectively matching the product's characteristics to the client's profile, identifying any potential misalignments. Finally, documenting the entire process, including the rationale for the recommendation, to ensure accountability and provide a clear audit trail. Question 16. The performance metrics show a significant decline in processing speed following a series of minor adjustments to the workflow. Management is eager to restore previous efficiency levels quickly. What is the most appropriate initial step to address this situation? Option A. Conduct a detailed review of the specific workflow adjustments made and their immediate impact on the processing steps, looking for any logical inconsistencies or unforeseen interaction. Option B. Focus on optimizing the most frequently used step in the workflow, assuming it is the primary bottleneck. Option C. Continue with the current process, attributing the performance dip to external factors and assuming it will self-correct. Option D. Immediately revert all recent workflow adjustments to their prior state to restore baseline performance. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed review of the specific workflow adjustments made and their immediate impact on the processing steps, looking for any logical inconsistencies or unforeseen interactions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in process optimization, where a seemingly minor change in a critical operational step could have cascading, unintended consequences. A professional challenge lies in balancing the desire for efficiency gains with the imperative to maintain regulatory compliance and operational integrity. A hasty decision without thorough impact assessment risks violating established procedures, potentially leading to financial penalties, reputational damage, or even operational failure. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the performance dip and to evaluate potential solutions holistically. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, data-driven investigation into the root cause of the performance decline. This aligns with best professional practice by prioritizing understanding before action. It involves reviewing the specific changes implemented, their immediate impact on the process, and any downstream effects. This methodical approach ensures that any proposed optimization is based on factual evidence and addresses the actual problem, rather than a symptom. It also implicitly adheres to regulatory requirements for process control and change management, which typically mandate documented analysis and justification for operational modifications. Ethical considerations are met by ensuring that the pursuit of efficiency does not compromise safety, quality, or compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing a broad rollback of all recent changes without pinpointing the specific cause is an inefficient and potentially disruptive approach. It fails to learn from the situation and could undo beneficial optimizations. From a regulatory perspective, this reactive measure might be seen as a failure to properly manage change, as it doesn't demonstrate a controlled and analytical response to a performance issue. Ethically, it prioritizes expediency over a thorough understanding, which can lead to recurring problems. Focusing solely on the most visible or easily adjustable component of the process, without considering its interdependencies, is a superficial optimization attempt. This approach risks addressing a symptom rather than the disease, leading to a temporary fix or even exacerbating the underlying issue. Regulatory frameworks often require a comprehensive understanding of process interactions, and this narrow focus would likely fall short of that standard. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to consider the broader impact on the system. Ignoring the performance metrics altogether and continuing with the existing process assumes the dip is an anomaly or temporary. This is a failure of proactive management and a disregard for data-driven decision-making. It directly contravenes the principle of continuous improvement and can lead to significant compliance breaches if the performance issue is indicative of a systemic problem. Ethically, it represents negligence and a failure to uphold professional responsibilities to maintain optimal operational standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured problem-solving framework. This typically involves 1. Problem identification. Clearly define the issue using available data. 2. Root cause analysis. Employ techniques to understand why the problem is occurring. 3. Solution generation. Brainstorm potential solutions based on the root cause. 4. Impact assessment. Evaluate the potential benefits, risks, and regulatory implications of each solution. 5. Implementation and monitoring. Execute the chosen solution and track its effectiveness, making adjustments as needed. This iterative process ensures that optimizations are effective, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 17. Stakeholder feedback indicates that current operational workflows are experiencing delays and a lack of clarity, impacting overall productivity. To address this, a proposal has been put forward to optimize these processes. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices for process optimization in this scenario? Option A. Prioritize implementing changes suggested by the most vocal stakeholder, as their perspective is likely to represent the most critical issues. Option B. Conduct a thorough analysis of existing processes, gather detailed feedback from all involved stakeholders, define specific, measurable objectives for improvement, and then develop and implement targeted optimization strategies. Option C. Focus on reducing the number of steps in each process, regardless of the impact on quality or the need for specific controls. Option D. Immediately invest in and implement the latest available software solution, assuming it will automatically streamline all current inefficiencies. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough analysis of existing processes, gather detailed feedback from all involved stakeholders, define specific, measurable objectives for improvement, and then develop and implement targeted optimization strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficiency improvements with the potential impact on existing operational workflows and the satisfaction of key stakeholders. The challenge lies in identifying process optimization strategies that deliver tangible benefits without disrupting critical business functions or alienating those who rely on the current processes. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both effective and considerate of the human element in process change. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a data-driven and collaborative methodology. By first establishing clear objectives and metrics, it ensures that any proposed optimizations are aligned with business goals and can be objectively measured for success. Involving stakeholders early and throughout the process fosters buy-in, leverages their expertise, and mitigates resistance to change. This aligns with principles of good governance and ethical business conduct, ensuring that decisions are informed, transparent, and consider the impact on all parties. It also reflects a commitment to continuous improvement, a core tenet of effective operational management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing new technology without understanding the underlying processes or stakeholder needs is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to wasted resources, failed implementations, and significant disruption. It fails to consider the human factor and the potential for resistance, which can undermine even the most technologically advanced solutions. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the impact on employees and operational continuity. Another incorrect approach that involves making significant changes based on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a single influential stakeholder, without broader validation or a structured analysis, is also professionally unsound. This approach is prone to bias, may not address the root causes of inefficiencies, and can lead to suboptimal or even detrimental outcomes. It lacks the rigor expected in professional decision-making and can erode trust among the wider team. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Define the problem and desired outcomes clearly, using measurable objectives. 2. Gather comprehensive data and insights from all relevant stakeholders. 3. Analyze existing processes to identify bottlenecks, redundancies, and areas for improvement. 4. Develop potential solutions, considering various optimization strategies. 5. Evaluate solutions based on feasibility, impact, cost, and alignment with objectives. 6. Pilot or test chosen solutions where appropriate. 7. Implement changes with clear communication and support for affected parties. 8. Monitor and measure the results, making adjustments as needed. Question 18. Consider a scenario where a company's board of directors receives a proposal for a significant strategic acquisition from a large, influential shareholder who is also a key customer. This shareholder is pressuring the board for a swift decision, emphasizing the immediate financial benefits of the acquisition for their own business, and suggesting that a quick approval would strengthen their commitment to the company. The board must decide how to proceed, balancing the shareholders' influence and potential benefits against their fiduciary duties to all shareholders and the company's long-term strategic interests. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the board? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive, independent evaluation of the proposed acquisition, considering its strategic fit, financial viability, potential risks, and long-term impact on all shareholders before making any decision. Option B. Reject the acquisition outright to avoid any appearance of favoritism towards a single shareholder, regardless of the proposal's potential merits. Option C. Agree to the acquisition based on the shareholders' assurances of immediate financial benefits, without conducting extensive due diligence, to expedite the process and maintain a positive relationship. Option D. Immediately approve the acquisition to secure the continued business and goodwill of the influential shareholder, given their significant stake and customer relationship. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive, independent evaluation of the proposed acquisition, considering its strategic fit, financial viability, potential risks, and long-term impact on all shareholders before making any decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial needs of a key stakeholder with the long-term fiduciary duty to all shareholders. The pressure from a significant investor to prioritize short-term gains can conflict with the company's strategic objectives and the sustainable growth that benefits all investors over time. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of corporate governance principles and the legal obligations of directors. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective assessment of the proposed transaction's impact on the company's long-term value and its alignment with the company's strategic plan. This aligns with the fiduciary duty of directors to act in the best interests of the company and all its shareholders, not just a vocal minority. It also adheres to principles of good corporate governance, which emphasize transparency, fairness, and informed decision-making. This approach ensures that decisions are based on sound business judgment and a comprehensive understanding of potential risks and rewards, rather than succumbing to undue influence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Prioritizing the immediate demands of the large investor without independent due diligence will be a failure of fiduciary duty. This approach risks acting on behalf of a single stakeholder at the expense of others, potentially leading to suboptimal outcomes for the company and its broader shareholder base. It could also be seen as a breach of the duty of care, as it bypasses the rigorous evaluation necessary for significant corporate action. Accepting the investor's proposal solely to maintain a positive relationship, without a proper assessment of its merits, is also a failure. It prioritizes expediency and personal relationships over the company's best interests and the collective good of its shareholders. It demonstrates a lack of independent judgment and could expose the company to significant risks if the proposal is not strategically sound. Ignoring the investor's concerns entirely without any engagement or consideration would be a failure in stakeholder management and potentially in the duty of good faith. While the company must act in the best interests of all shareholders, a complete dismissal of a significant investor's input, especially if it stems from a genuine concern about company performance, can be detrimental to investor relations and may indicate a lack of responsiveness. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding their fiduciary duties to the company and all shareholders. This involves a commitment to acting with care, loyalty, and in good faith. The decision-making process should be structured, objective, and evidence-based. Key steps include: 1. Understanding the specific proposal and its implications. 2. Conducting thorough due diligence including financial, strategic, and operational assessments. 3. Consulting with relevant internal and external advisors, legal, financial. 4. Evaluating the proposal against the company's long-term strategy and objectives. 5. Considering the impact on all stakeholder groups. 6. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the final decision. 7. Communicating the decision and its justification transparently to relevant parties. Question 19. To address the challenge of launching a new product rapidly to capture market share, what is the most responsible approach to ensure long-term viability and minimize potential negative externalities? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that evaluates environmental, social, and governance-esque factors alongside financial projections to identify and mitigate potential risks before launch. Option B. Rely on initial positive customer feedback to gauge the product's impact, deferring any formal assessment until significant issues arise. Option C. Focus exclusively on the projected financial returns and market penetration rates, as these are the primary indicators of success for a new product. Option D. Prioritize speed to market above all else, assuming that any negative consequences can be addressed reactively after the product has gained significant traction. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment that evaluates environmental, social, and governance-esque factors alongside financial projections to identify and mitigate potential risks before launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a new product launch with the potential long-term and possibly unforeseen negative consequences of that launch. The pressure to meet market demands and competitor actions can lead to rushed decisions that bypass thorough impact assessments. This can result in significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and financial losses if the product negatively affects consumers or the environment. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the pursuit of short-term gains does not compromise long-term sustainability and ethical obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a comprehensive impact assessment that considers environmental, social, and governance-esque factors. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and the growing regulatory expectation for companies to understand and mitigate their broader societal and environmental footprint. Such an assessment would identify potential risks, such as resource depletion, waste generation, or adverse effects on vulnerable communities, and allow for the development of mitigation strategies before the product reaches the market. This proactive approach demonstrates a commitment to sustainability and corporate social responsibility, which is increasingly becoming a benchmark for best professional practice and a key consideration for investors and consumers. It also helps ensure compliance with evolving ESG disclosure requirements and avoids potential future regulatory scrutiny. Incorrect approaches analysis. Prioritizing only the speed of market entry without a proper impact assessment is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It suggests a disregard for potential harm to consumers, the environment, or society, which can lead to violations of consumer protection laws, environmental regulations, and ethical codes of conduct. This approach prioritizes profit over responsibility, focusing solely on the financial projections and potential revenue without considering the broader implications of the product's lifecycle is another failure. This narrow financial focus can lead to the overlooking of significant ESG risks that could materialize later, resulting in substantial financial liabilities, fines, and reputational damage that far outweigh the initial projected profits. It also fails to meet the expectations of stakeholders, who are increasingly demanding transparency and accountability on ESG matters. Ignoring potential negative feedback from early adopters and focusing only on positive reviews is also professionally unacceptable. This selective attention to feedback prevents the identification of emerging issues that could escalate into larger problems. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to product improvement and customer well-being, potentially violating consumer rights and leading to regulatory intervention if product defects or safety concerns are not addressed promptly. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that integrates risk management with ethical considerations and stakeholder engagement. This involves 1. Identifying all potential stakeholders and their interests. 2. Proactively assessing the potential positive and negative impacts of a decision across environmental, social, and governance dimensions. 3. Evaluating these impacts against relevant legal and regulatory requirements as well as ethical principles. 4. Developing mitigation strategies for identified risks and contingency plans. 5. Communicating transparently with stakeholders about the assessment and mitigation plans. 6. Continuously monitoring and reviewing the impacts post-implementation. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not only commercially viable, but also responsible and sustainable. Question 20. Upon reviewing a client's investment portfolio and financial goals, an advisor identifies that a particular investment product, which offers a significantly higher commission to the advisor, appears to meet the client's stated objectives. However, the advisor also recognizes that a different, lower commission product, while less profitable for the firm, is arguably a more straightforward and potentially better suited option for the client's specific risk profile and liquidity needs. The client has expressed a desire for simplicity and capital preservation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Recommend a diversified portfolio of simpler, low-cost index funds that may not directly align with the client's stated objectives, but offer broad market exposure and minimal advisor involvement. Option B. Recommend the higher commission product, emphasizing its alignment with the client's stated objectives and downplaying the differences in suitability compared to the alternative. Option C. Recommend the lower commission product after a thorough discussion of its suitability and the client's objectives, explaining why it is the preferred choice despite the lower commission. Option D. Recommend the higher commission product, but only after disclosing the commission difference and obtaining explicit client consent to proceed. The correct answer is C. Recommend the lower commission product after a thorough discussion of its suitability and the client's objectives, explaining why it is the preferred choice despite the lower commission. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate financial interests and the long-term fiduciary duty owed to them. The advisor must navigate the pressure to generate revenue through a specific product while upholding their obligation to act in the client's best interest, considering suitability and potential conflicts of interest. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial objectives with regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's needs and circumstances above all else. This aligns with the core principles of client-centric advice mandated by regulatory frameworks such as the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which emphasizes treating customers fairly, TCF, and ensuring that products and services are suitable for the client. By conducting a thorough needs analysis and recommending the most appropriate solution, even if it means foregoing immediate commission, the advisor demonstrates integrity and builds long-term trust, which is a cornerstone of sustainable financial advisory. This approach adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations requiring suitability assessments and disclosure of any potential conflicts. An incorrect approach that involves pushing the client towards the higher commission product without a thorough assessment of its suitability for their specific situation would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would likely breach the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 7, Communications with Clients. By not acting honestly, professionally, and in accordance with the best interests of the client, could also lead to breaches of specific rules regarding product suitability and disclosure of conflicts of interest, potentially resulting in disciplinary action, fines, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as recommending a product that is clearly not the most suitable but is less complex and therefore easier to explain, would still be ethically and regulatorily unsound. While it might avoid a direct conflict of interest related to commission, it fails the fundamental test of suitability and acting in the client's best interests. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to meet the professional standards expected of an advisor. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the client's needs and objectives. Thoroughly understand the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, investment goals, and time horizon. 2. Assess product suitability. Evaluate all available products against the client's identified needs and objectives. This includes understanding the features, benefits, risks, and costs of each product. 3. Identify and manage conflicts of interest. Be transparent about any potential conflicts, such as commission structures, and ensure they do not influence the recommendation. If a conflict cannot be managed, it may be necessary to decline to advise or recommend an alternative. 4. Prioritize client best interest. The recommendation must unequivocally serve the client's best interests, even if it means lower personal gain. 5. Document the decision. Maintain clear and comprehensive records of the client's needs, the assessment process, the rationale for the recommendation, and any disclosures made.